The morning Donna Whitfield filed a formal HOA complaint accusing me of reckless driving through the Birchwood Estates neighborhood at speeds she estimated at 45 miles per hour. I was sitting at my kitchen table reading the complaint letter with a cup of coffee and the specific expression I reserve for documents that are both factually incorrect and strategically unwise for the person who filed them. 45 miles per hour. In a residential neighborhood with a posted limit of 15. In a 2019 Honda Civic with a factory-installed GPS data recorder that logged my speed, location, and driving behavior continuously, and that I had never once needed to think about because I had never once driven 45 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. I read the complaint letter a second time. Then I thought about Donna Whitfield and the 4 months of increasingly hostile interactions that had preceded this letter, and I understood clearly what the letter was. It was not a safety complaint. It was a pressure tactic. Donna had been trying to get me to stop parking my work truck in front of my own house for 4 months. The truck was a 2018 Ford F-250, white, with my company name on the side because I ran a small landscaping operation from my home and the truck was my primary work vehicle. The HOA's vehicle standards policy allowed commercial vehicles to be parked in private driveways, but placed restrictions on street parking of commercial vehicles with visible business markings for extended periods. I parked the truck in my driveway, not on the street. In my driveway behind the garage, which was a private driveway on private property that I owned. Donna had sent 4 letters in 4 months arguing that my driveway was visible from the street and that a commercial vehicle with business markings visible from the street violated the community's aesthetic standards regardless of whether it was on private property or public road. My attorney, Patricia Cole, had addressed each letter with a response noting that the HOA's vehicle standards policy explicitly covered street parking and contained no provision governing the appearance of vehicles on private driveways. She had cited the specific policy section each time. Each time Donna had sent a new letter finding a different angle. The reckless driving complaint was angle 5. It was the least subtle angle because it was also the least true. My name is James Holloway. I am 38 years old, owner of Holloway Grounds and Landscaping, homeowner for 4 years on Sycamore Drive in Birchwood Estates, a residential development outside of Louisville, Kentucky. I had lived on Sycamore Drive for 4 years without a single complaint from any neighbor or any HOA communication of any kind until Donna Whitfield became HOA president in September. Donna had been president for 5 months. In 5 months, she had sent me 5 letters. The reckless driving complaint was the 5th letter, and the first one I read with something other than the measured patience I had been maintaining through the process. Not because it made me angry, because it gave me an idea. I put the letter down and looked out the window at Sycamore Drive. The posted speed limit was 15 miles per hour. This was standard for interior residential streets in Birchwood Estates. 15 miles per hour was the speed at which I always drove on Sycamore Drive because it was where I lived and I was not in a hurry on my own street. I thought about what 15 miles per hour looked like. Then I thought about what 1 mile per hour looked like. And then I thought about my hazard lights. I called Patricia. She answered, and I told her about the reckless driving complaint. She said she filed an HOA complaint for reckless driving. I said 45 miles per hour on a 15-mile-per-hour street. She said, "Do you have GPS data from the vehicle?" I said my Honda has a factory GPS recorder. The data is accessible through the manufacturer's Connected Services app. I can pull the speed log for any date going back 90 days. She said, "Pull every date you have driven on Sycamore Drive in the past 90 days and document your actual speeds." I said, "I will do that today." She said, "James, This complaint is baseless, but I want it addressed formally before we respond. I want to respond to a reckless driving complaint with GPS data showing your actual speeds. I said, understood. She said, is there anything else you want to do? I said, Patricia, I have a thought. She said, tell me. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you want to drive past her house at 1 mile per hour with your hazard lights on. I said, every day, on my way out to work in the morning and on my way home in the evening. She said, you are going to drive 1 mile per hour past her house. I said 1 mile per hour is a legal speed on a public road with a 15 mile per hour limit. Hazard lights are a legal vehicle operation under Kentucky traffic law when a vehicle is moving slowly enough to constitute a potential traffic hazard or as a courtesy warning to other drivers. She said 1 mile per hour is a potential traffic hazard. I said it is considerably below the posted limit. She said, James. I said, Patricia. She said, is this going to make things worse? I said, it is going to make things documented. Every pass on a public road at a legal speed with legal vehicle operation. No violation of any HOA rule because the HOA has no authority over my speed on a public road. No violation of any traffic law because 1 mile per hour is legal. And a daily demonstration that I take speed limits very seriously. She said, how seriously? I said, 1 mile per hour seriously. She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, I cannot advise you to do something that is specifically designed to irritate a neighbor. I said, I am going to drive slowly and safely on my residential street in consideration of community safety. She said, at 1 mile per hour. I said, Donna said I was driving 45. I want to make sure that concern is thoroughly addressed. Patricia said, pull the GPS data, respond to the complaint formally, and James. I said, yes. She said, be careful about obstruction of traffic. I said 1 mile per hour for the length of her house frontage is approximately 40 seconds of travel time. Her house frontage is 60 feet. That is not obstruction. That is cautious driving. She said, I did not hear you say that. I said, I know. I pulled the GPS data from my Honda's connected services that afternoon. The data showed every trip I had made on Sycamore Drive for the prior 90 days. My maximum speed on Sycamore Drive in 90 days of driving was 14.3 miles per hour, recorded on a day when I had been slightly later than usual getting to a job site. My average speed on Sycamore Drive was 11.2 miles per hour. I had never exceeded the 15 mile per hour limit. Not once. Not even close. I printed the full 90-day speed log and highlighted the Sycamore Drive entries. Patricia sent the formal response to the HOA board the following Monday. The response attached the GPS speed log. It noted that my maximum recorded speed on Sycamore Drive in the prior 90 days was 14.3 miles per hour. It noted that the complaint alleged 45 miles per hour. It noted that the complaint was factually incorrect by a margin of more than 300%. It requested that the complaint be formally dismissed and removed from my HOA file as unfounded. It also noted that filing a knowingly false complaint with the HOA board might constitute harassment under Kentucky civil law and requested that the board consider whether the complaint had been filed in good faith. The response went to the full board, not just to Donna. The full board consisted of Donna as president and 4 other members. I did not know the 4 other members well. I knew them by sight. One of them, a man named Gerald Morrison, who had been on the board since before Donna's election, had nodded at me at the mailbox 2 weeks earlier in a way that suggested he was aware of the letter situation and had an opinion about it. The formal response was distributed on Monday. I began driving past Donna's house at 1 mile per hour on Tuesday. I want to describe what 1 mile per hour looks like in a Honda Civic on a residential street, because the visual is important to understanding the story. 1 mile per hour is approximately 1.47 feet per second. In a Honda Civic with the engine at idle, 1 mile per hour requires almost no throttle, and the brake applied lightly to prevent the vehicle from creeping faster under its own engine braking. At 1 mile per hour, a 60-foot house frontage takes approximately 41 seconds to pass. With the hazard lights on, the amber turn indicators flash at the standard rate, visible from both directions, signaling to any approaching driver that the vehicle ahead is moving unusually slowly. I drove to work at 7:15 in the morning and returned between 4:30 and 5:30, depending on the day's jobs. Tuesday, I drove past at 1 mile per hour, with the hazards on in the morning and again in the afternoon. Wednesday, the same. Thursday, the same. By Thursday afternoon, Donna's car was in her driveway, and she was standing on her porch watching me drive past. 41 seconds is a long time to be watched. I maintained 1 mile per hour for the full 41 seconds, hazards flashing, engine at idle, looking forward at the road ahead. I did not look at Donna. I did not wave. I did not acknowledge her in any way. I reached the end of her frontage, accelerated to my normal 11 miles per hour, and drove home. Bill Tanner, my neighbor 2 houses down, who was a retired mechanical engineer and who I had always gotten along with, was washing his car when I pulled into my driveway on Thursday afternoon. He said, "Was that you going past Donna's at about walking speed?" I said, "I have been made aware of concerns about my driving speed in the neighborhood. I am addressing them." He looked at me. He said, "The complaint." I said, "The one alleging 45 miles per hour." He said, "James." I said, "Bill." He said, "Your GPS data." I said, 14.3 maximum. He said, "And your response?" I said, 1 mile per hour. He looked at my car. He looked down the street toward Donna's house. He said, "How long are you going to do this?" I said, "Until the complaint is formally dismissed and removed from my file." He said, "That seems reasonable." I said, "I thought so." He went back to washing his car. I went inside and checked my phone. I had a message from Gerald Morrison. It said, "Saw your attorney's response. Board meeting Thursday evening, worth attending if you are available." That was the end of part 1. The GPS data was in the board's hands. The 1 mile per hour drives were underway. Gerald Morrison had sent me a message about a board meeting. And Donna Whitfield had stood on her porch for 41 seconds watching me drive past her house at the speed of a brisk walk with amber lights flashing, and had experienced what I hoped was the specific feeling of having filed a complaint about something that was now being addressed with complete and total seriousness. Part 2 is where the board meeting happened and where the campaign of cautious driving produced an outcome I had designed for and a conversation I had not anticipated. Karen accused me of speeding, so I drove 1 mph past her house every day with my hazards on. The Thursday board meeting was held at 7 in the evening at the Birchwood Estates Community Center, which was a modest building near the development's entrance with a meeting room that held about 30 people, and that had the specific acoustic quality of rooms designed for community use that absorbed sound in a way that made people speak slightly louder than necessary. I arrived at 6:55. Gerald Morrison was already there, setting out chairs with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times. He saw me come in and gave me a nod that communicated more than a nod usually does, which was that he had read the response letter and that the evening was going to be interesting. The other 3 non-Donna board members arrived in the next 10 minutes. Donna arrived at 7:02. She saw me and her expression did the specific compression that expressions do when a person arrives somewhere and finds someone they had not expected. She sat at the board table. I sat in the resident seating. There were 6 other residents in the room, including Bill Tanner, who had apparently decided the meeting was worth his time. Gerald called the meeting to order. The first agenda item was routine, budget review, nothing significant. The second agenda item was listed on the printed agenda as complaint review and policy discussion. Gerald said, "I want to address a formal complaint that was filed last week and the response that was received from the named resident." He distributed copies of the complaint letter and Patricia's response to all board members and to the residents who wanted one. Donna said, "This is a personnel matter and should be addressed in closed session." Gerald said, "Complaints against residents are not personnel matters. They are governance matters and they are addressed in open session per our bylaws." Donna said, "I filed that complaint in my capacity as board president based on community safety concerns." Gerald said, "The complaint alleges reckless driving at 45 miles per hour. The response includes a GPS speed log from the named resident's vehicle showing a maximum speed of 14.3 miles per hour on the street in question over a 90-day period. I want the board to discuss this." A board member named Howard Park, who was in his late 40s and who I knew had moved to Birchwood Estates from a different development where he had also been on the HOA board, said, "Has anyone independently verified the GPS data?" Gerald said, "The response includes the data source, which is the manufacturer's connected services platform. The data format is consistent with factory GPS logs. I am not aware of any reason to doubt its authenticity." Howard said, "Donna, what is the basis for the 45 mile per hour estimate?" Donna said, "My personal observation." Howard said, "Your personal observation that he was driving 45 in a 15 mile per hour zone." Donna said, "That is my estimate, yes." Howard said, "And the GPS data shows 14.3 maximum." Donna said, "Devices can be inaccurate." Gerald said, "The manufacturer's GPS data system is used in insurance claims and accident reconstruction. It is considered reliable enough for legal proceedings." Donna said, "I am not a technical expert on GPS systems." Gerald said, "Neither am I, but the discrepancy between 45 and 14.3 is significant enough that I think the board needs to evaluate the complaint carefully." The third board member, a woman named Susan Aldrich, who had been quiet through the exchange, said, "I want to ask about the pattern. This is the 5th letter sent to Mr. Holloway in 5 months. The first 4 were about his work truck parked in his driveway. Those letters were addressed by his attorney each time, with citations showing the HOA policy didn't cover private driveways. The 5th is about reckless driving. I want the board to consider whether this pattern is appropriate." Donna said, "I am enforcing community standards." Susan said, "You are filing complaints that have been addressed as unfounded 4 times, and now a 5th complaint about something the GPS data suggests is not accurate. I have a concern about that pattern." Donna said, "The truck is an eyesore." Gerald said, "Donna, whether the truck is an eyesore is not the question in front of the board tonight. The question is whether the reckless driving complaint was filed in good faith and whether it should remain in Mr. Holloway's file." I raised my hand. Gerald acknowledged me. I stood up and said, "I want to address the board briefly." Gerald said, "Go ahead." I said, "I have been a resident of Birchwood Estates for 4 years. I have received 5 HOA communications in the past 5 months, all from the board president. The first 4 concern my work truck, which is parked in my private driveway and which my attorney has established is not covered by the HOA's vehicle standards policy. The 5th, alleged reckless driving at 45 miles per hour. My GPS data shows my maximum speed on this street in 90 days was 14.3 miles per hour. I said I want to ask the board to formally dismiss the reckless driving complaint as unfounded and to remove it from my file. I also want to ask the board to review whether the pattern of complaints against my property is consistent with the HOA's complaint policy. I sat down. Gerald said, "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." He looked at the board. He said, "I am going to call for a vote on the complaint dismissal. All in favor of dismissing the reckless driving complaint as unfounded and removing it from the resident's file." Howard Park said aye. Susan Aldrich said aye. The fourth board member, a man named Dennis Webb, who had said nothing during the meeting, but who had been reading Patricia's response letter while everyone spoke, said aye. Gerald said aye. Donna said no. Gerald said, "The motion carries 4-1. The complaint is dismissed and will be removed from Mr. Holloway's file." He said, "I also want to note for the record that the board will be reviewing the complaint filing policy at the next meeting to ensure that future complaints meet a minimum documentation standard before they are formally filed." Donna said, "That is not necessary." Gerald said, "I believe it is. 4 complaints addressed as unfounded by the respondent's attorney and 1 dismissed by board vote in the same 5-month period from the same filer suggests that the current policy is not functioning as intended." Donna said, "I am the board president." Gerald said, "You are the board president. The board has 4 other members." The meeting moved to other items. Afterward, in the parking lot, Gerald came to where I was standing by my car. He said, "The 1 mile per hour." I said, "You heard about that?" He said, "Bill Tanner mentioned it." I said, "I have been addressing the community's speed concerns." Gerald said, "At 1 mile per hour." I said, "Donna alleged 45. I want to make sure there is no question about my commitment to safe driving on Sycamore Drive." Gerald looked at me. He said, "James, I have been on this board for 3 years. Donna has been president for 5 months. In those 5 months, the complaint volume has tripled and every complaint involving you has been found unfounded." I said, "I noticed that pattern." He said, "So did the rest of the board." He said, "I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Go ahead." He said, "The truck, is there any version of a solution that works for you?" I said, "The truck is in my driveway. The HOA policy does not cover private driveways. I have the legal right to park it there." He said, "I know. I am not asking about the legal right. I am asking about the practical situation." I said, "Gerald, I have been parking the truck there for 4 years. Nobody had an issue with it for 3.5 years. Donna has had an issue with it for 5 months." He said, "Yes." He said, "Would it change anything if the board sent a formal letter acknowledging that your driveway is outside the policy's scope and that no further complaints about the truck's location will be accepted?" I said, "That would be a meaningful document." He said, "I thought it might." He said, "What would it take to stop the 1 mile per hour drives?" I said, "The complaint dismissed and removed from my file, done tonight, the formal letter about the truck, and no further complaints about things that are explicitly outside the HOA's policy scope." He said, "I can get the letter through the board." I said, "Then the 1 mile per hour drives conclude." He said, "The complaint is already dismissed." I said, "Then we need the letter." He said, "Give me 2 weeks." The letter arrived in 11 days. It was on official HOA letterhead, signed by all 5 board members, including Donna, who I suspected had signed under some level of board pressure, and it stated that the board had reviewed the HOA's vehicle standards policy and confirmed that the policy applied to street parking and not to vehicles parked on private residential driveways, and that Mr. Holloway's work vehicle parked in his private driveway on Sycamore Drive was not in violation of any HOA policy, and that no complaints regarding the vehicle's location would be accepted for formal processing. I read the letter twice. Then I called Patricia and read it to her. She said, "That is a binding written acknowledgement by the full board." I said, "Including Donna's signature?" She said, "Especially Donna's signature." I put it in my file with the GPS data and the dismissed complaint and the 4 prior letters and Patricia's 4 responses. The file was now 7 items. I drove to work the following morning at my normal 11 miles per hour without stopping the hazard lights. Bill Tanner was checking his mail when I passed his house. He looked up. I waved. He waved back. I drove the full length of Sycamore Drive past Donna's house at 11 miles per hour, with my hazard lights off and my speed exactly where it had always been. Donna's car was in her driveway, but I did not see her at the window. That afternoon, I drove home the same way. Normal speed, no hazards. The campaign of cautious driving had lasted 11 days. Donna sent no further letters. She remained board president for another 7 months before resigning, Gerald told me later, citing personal reasons. In those 7 months, she sent no further communications to my address. The truck stayed in my driveway. Gerald called me the week after Donna's resignation to let me know. He said, "I thought you should hear it from me." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "The board is conducting a review of all complaints filed in the prior year. Some of them are being re-evaluated." I said, "Good." He said, "James, I want to ask you about the 1 mile per hour." I said, "What about it?" He said, "Did you know it would work?" I said, "I knew it would document something. I did not know it would produce a board meeting." He said, "What did you think it would produce?" I said, "I thought it would produce documentation of me driving the legal speed limit on a public road, while Donna had a formal complaint on file saying I drove 45. Every day I drove 1 mile per hour past her house was another day. The contrast between the complaint and the reality was visible." He said, "To anyone who saw it." I said, "Including board members who drive down Sycamore Drive." He said, "Susan Aldrich lives 2 streets over. She drives down Sycamore to get to the main road." I said, "I know." He said, "She mentioned the slow driving to me before the meeting." I said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said she had seen you driving past Donna's house very slowly with your hazards on twice, and she wanted to know what was happening." I said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her to come to Thursday's meeting." I said, "And she came?" He said, "She voted for the dismissal." I said, "Yes." He said, "James." I said, "Gerald." He said, "The 1 mile per hour got Susan Aldrich's attention before the meeting." I said, "I drive carefully on residential streets." He said, 1 mile per hour carefully." I said, "Donna seemed concerned about speed." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a professional courtesy laugh, the kind of laugh that comes when something is actually funny, in the way that situations become funny when enough time has passed and enough resolution has occurred. I drove Sycamore Drive at 11 miles per hour for the next 4 years without incident. The truck stayed in the driveway. The letter from the board stayed in my file. The GPS data stayed in the manufacturer's connected services, available any time I needed it. I never needed it again. Here is what I will leave you with. Donna Whitfield filed a complaint saying I was driving 45 miles per hour. The GPS data showed 14.3. The gap between those 2 numbers was the case. The 1 mile per hour was not the case. The 1 mile per hour was the demonstration that I took the case seriously enough to address it with thoroughness. A person who drives 45 miles per hour through a residential neighborhood does not respond to a reckless driving complaint by driving 1 mile per hour with the hazard lights on. A person who has GPS data showing 14.3 does. Because when you know you are right, You can afford to be completely, thoroughly, visibly right. You can afford 41 seconds of amber lights on a 60-foot house frontage. You can afford 11 days of cautious driving on a public road at a perfectly legal speed. You can afford to let the contrast between the complaint and the reality be visible to everyone who drives down Sycamore Drive. The contrast was the argument. The driving was the argument being made in amber lights and 1 mile per hour. Know your data, know your rights, know what the law allows on a public road at a legal speed. And if someone files a complaint about your driving, address it. Address it very carefully, very slowly, with your hazard lights on. Drop your thoughts below. If an HOA or a neighbor has filed a complaint against you that was factually incorrect, tell me about it. And if you have a GPS data recorder in your vehicle, know how to access it. Because your data is your defense. And sometimes your defense drives past at 1 mile per hour, with amber lights flashing for 11 days, until the board votes 4-1 in your favor. That is a good